There's a family living somewhere in the mountains of East Tennessee right now who has spent 200 years being told they were lying about who they were. Not lying about something small, lying about their own blood. Government clerks looked their great-great-grandparents in the eye and refused to write down the same word twice. One census, they were white. 10 years later, the same household, same farm, same faces, and the box checked was mulatto. 10 years after that, white again. Nobody moved, nobody remarried, nobody's blood changed. Only the man holding the pen changed, and what he decided to believe when he looked at that family standing in the doorway. For 2 centuries, these people were called liars, frauds, issue. A word used the way you'd use a slur, and worse. They were pushed off the good bottomland and up onto ridgelines nobody else wanted. They built churches nobody would sit in. They told outsiders whatever story felt safest that decade. Portuguese sailors, lost colonists, Turkish traders, Cherokee royalty. Because the truth, whatever it actually was, could cost you your land, your vote, your marriage license, or your children. And their own families sometimes wouldn't say the word out loud at their own kitchen tables. They were called Melungeons, and for almost 300 years, nobody, not historians, not the families themselves, not the state of Tennessee, could actually prove what that word meant, where these people came from, or why an entire population spent 2 centuries being treated as neither fully white nor fully anything else anyone had a name for. Then DNA testing happened. And in the last 15 years, quietly, without most of the country ever hearing about it, science finally started answering a question the American legal system spent 3 centuries actively refusing to ask, honestly. If your family traces through the mountains of East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, or Eastern Kentucky, and there has always been a story in your family, an odd, specific, slightly too elaborate story about where your people really came from, stay with me for the next 30 minutes. Because there is a real chance that story was never actually about Portugal or Turkey or a Cherokee princess. There's a chance it was a cover story. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what it was covering, how to spot it in your own family tree, and what your DNA test has probably already told you without you realizing it. This is the full story of the Melungeons. 7 signs your family might carry this bloodline, the actual documented history behind each one, and the DNA science that finally cracked a mystery 300 years in the making. Stay to the end because sign 7 ties directly into the exact numbers sitting in your own ancestry results right now, and it explains something almost every Melungeon-descended family has been told their whole life and never fully understood. Before we get into the 7 signs, you need a little bit of background, because none of this makes sense without understanding what colonial Virginia and the Carolinas actually looked like before the word Melungeon ever existed. In the earliest decades of English settlement in Virginia, race was not the rigid, binary system most Americans picture when they think about the colonial South. Before roughly 1660 to 1680, colonial Virginia had a genuinely fluid, chaotic labor system. Indentured servants of English, Irish, and African origin worked side by side, often under identical contracts, often for the same length of time, and often with the same legal path to freedom once their term ended. Free black landowners existed in early Virginia. Interracial marriages between free people happened, were recorded, and in some counties were not yet illegal. A free black man or woman, a free mixed-race couple, could own land, raise a family, and pass property down to their children, the same as any English family nearby. That window closed, slowly, then very suddenly. Between the 1660s and the early 1700s, Virginia and the surrounding colonies passed a cascading series of laws specifically designed to harden race into a fixed, inheritable legal category tied directly to slavery, and to make interracial marriage illegal, unions already in existence be damned. Some of these laws grandfathered in existing free mixed-race families as free persons of color, a strange, unstable legal middle ground, not enslaved, but not fully free in rights either, not white, but sometimes treated as white in practice, depending entirely on the county, the year, and the clerk behind the desk that day. This is the world the ancestors of the Melungeon families were living in. Free, mixed-race, often landowning families, caught on the wrong side of a legal line that got drawn after their families already existed. As Virginia's laws tightened, many of these families didn't wait around to see how the next round of restrictions would treat them. They moved west, into the Carolina backcountry, then further west, over the mountains, into the most isolated, least desirable, hardest to farm land available, land nobody else wanted badly enough to ask too many questions about who was living on it. By the time Scots-Irish and English settlers were pushing down the Great Wagon Road into southwest Virginia and East Tennessee in the mid to late 1700s, these mixed-race families were often already there, established, isolated, and almost immediately treated with suspicion by the new arrivals, who had their own rigid ideas about race and no interest in a population they couldn't neatly categorize. That's the world sign one grows out of. Sign 1, Your family has deep roots in a specific handful of Appalachian counties, and nobody can fully explain how they got there first. The communities that came to be known as Melungeon were concentrated in an extremely tight cluster of ridges and hollows, Hancock County in Tennessee above all, especially the area around Newman's Ridge, along with pockets of southwest Virginia, particularly Lee and Scott counties, eastern Kentucky, and small clusters in western North Carolina. Local historians in Hancock County have pointed for over a century to the same specific settlements, Vardy, Blackwater, and Snake Hollow as the tightest core of these communities. These were families that stayed within a few miles of each other for generation after generation, marrying within the same small circle of surnames, decade after decade, even as waves of new settlers filled in the surrounding valleys around them. Here's the part that should stop you. These families show up in tax rolls and court records as early as the 1760s and 1770s, already established and already flagged in local records as free persons of color, or mulatto, decades before the main wave of Scots-Irish and English settlement fully filled out the region. Most Appalachian family histories start with a clean migration story, a specific ship, a specific port, a specific wagon road south from Philadelphia. The Melungeon story doesn't start that way. These families appear to already be there, tucked into terrain that was, and in places still is, difficult to reach by road. Exactly the kind of ground a family actively trying to stay out of a courthouse's line of sight would choose on purpose. That geographic stubbornness matters. Staying on hard, rocky, marginal mountain land for 200 years, when better farmland sat just a few miles down the valley, is not what you'd expect from a population simply arriving late to good real estate. It's what you'd expect from a population that had already learned the hard way, that visibility to the outside world came with a cost. If your family has lived in the same tight cluster of counties for more generations than anyone can actually count, and the honest answer to how did we end up here first has always been a shrug, or worse, a story that doesn't quite hold together, that isolation itself is one of the strongest signs of Melungeon descent. Sign 2. Your family carries a surname from the historical Melungeon core list. Certain surnames appear again and again in the tax rolls, court dockets, and church records of these communities, and researchers have used this exact list to trace Melungeon lineage for well over a century. Collins, Gibson, Goins, sometimes spelled Goin or Goin, Bunch, Bolin, sometimes Bolin, Mullins, Sexton, Moore, Nichols, Denham, Bell in specific Hancock County lines distinct from the broader Scots-Irish bells. On their own, these are unremarkable English surnames, common across the entire American South. What makes them meaningful here is concentration and context. Carried by families rooted specifically in Hancock County, Newman's Ridge, or the surrounding Lee and Scott County communities in Virginia, and flagged repeatedly across generations of court and tax documents as free-colored or mulatto, these surnames stop being generic and start functioning almost like a genealogical fingerprint. There's a specific piece of legal history worth knowing here, because it shows exactly how seriously this classification was taken. In 1834, a Hancock County resident named William Chestnut Bell sued, along with other members of Melungeon-associated families, over their right to vote, a right reserved for free white men under Tennessee's 1834 Constitution, which had specifically tightened its language to exclude free people of color from the franchise. These cases, along with several other so-called free-issue legal disputes across Tennessee and Virginia the decades before the Civil War, hinged entirely on whether a specific family, often one carrying exactly these surnames, could successfully argue their whiteness in front of a judge. Win, and you kept your vote, your land, and your legal standing. Lose, and your family was formally reclassified, with consequences that could follow for generations. If one of these surnames sits in your family tree, tied specifically to that pocket of Tennessee, Virginia, or Kentucky, and you notice that old census records or court cases repeatedly disagree about how your ancestors should be classified, you are very likely looking at a documented Melungeon line, one that may have literally had its whiteness argued and decided in a courtroom at some point during the 1800s. Sign 3. Your family carries an origin story that sounds almost too elaborate to be a coincidence. Portuguese sailors, Turkish or Ottoman traders, the lost Roanoke colonists, or Cherokee royalty. For roughly 2 centuries, Melungeon families and the people around them told a rotating cast of explanations for who these communities actually were. Some said Portuguese sailors had been shipwrecked off the Carolina coast generations earlier and simply walked inland till they reached the mountains. Others pointed to Ottoman or North African sailors supposedly left behind by early Mediterranean naval expeditions that never returned to Europe. Some traced the story to the lost colonists of Roanoke, the vanished 16th century English settlement, theorizing that those colonists intermarried with local coastal tribes and slowly drifted west, generation after generation, until they eventually reached the Tennessee mountains. Some families simply said, Portuguese, full stop, using the word almost as a placeholder, a way of saying something else, something not quite English, but also not anything carrying a harsher legal label in the antebellum South. None of these specific origin stories has ever been confirmed by the genetic or documentary record. Most serious historians researching this population today treat them less as literal history and more as protective folklore. Stories a family could offer a curious or suspicious neighbor that sounded exotic, vaguely European, safely distant, and impossible to disprove with the tools available at the time. A word like Portuguese carried none of the legal weight that mulatto or free-colored carried on a census form or in front of a judge. It allowed a family to sidestep the entire legal apparatus built around blackness in the antebellum South, without claiming to be plainly English or Scots-Irish either, since neighbors could often tell, simply by looking, that something about that explanation did not completely fit. If your family carries one of these stories, Portuguese, Turkish, Black Dutch, or some version of the lost colony theory, and nobody across 5 or 6 generations has ever identified the actual ship, ancestor, or colony that supposedly explains it, that vague but oddly specific origin myth is not merely a colorful piece of family lore. It is sign 3. It usually means that somewhere far back in the family, the real explanation was considered too dangerous or legally costly to say openly, so a safer story was created and repeated until, after enough generations, the family itself came to believe it. Sign 4, your family has records that flatly contradict themselves on race from one census, tax roll, or court document to the next. This is one of the most reliable and, honestly, one of the most jarring signs once you begin pulling original documents, instead of relying entirely on family memory. The exact same household appears as white in one federal census, free-colored or mulatto in the next census 10 years later, and then returns to white again in the census after that, with no migration, remarriage, or explanation anywhere in the paper trail. There is only a different census enumerator making a different judgment while standing on the same porch a decade later. This was not a minor bureaucratic quirk. Southern law throughout the 18th and 19th centuries drew an extremely hard legal line around whiteness, and that line controlled the right to vote, marry freely without a special county exemption, testify in court against a white person, legally own firearms, and in some periods and places, simply remain in the county without a bond or special pass. Which box was checked on a form was not a small detail. It was frequently the difference between a family keeping its land through the next generation or losing everything in a contested inheritance case. If you pull deeds, wills, tax lists, and census sheets across multiple decades for the same Appalachian ancestor, and the racial classification repeatedly changes depending on the year and whichever clerk happened to be counting that season, that inconsistency is not merely sloppy government record-keeping. It is one of the clearest surviving physical traces of a Melungeon family navigating a legal system that had no honest box available to describe them, forcing every generation to renegotiate, county official by county official, which side of an arbitrary and shifting line they would be allowed to stand on. Okay, that's 4 signs down, and we're just past the halfway mark. If you're finding your own family in any of this, hit subscribe now. Because the next 3 signs are where the physical descriptions, family legends, and finally the DNA science enter the story. And sign 7 connects everything directly to the specific numbers sitting in your own Ancestry test results. Every single week on this channel, we go this deep into the hidden histories running underneath American bloodlines, the stories that never quite made it into the textbooks. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let's keep going. Sign 5. Your family has always been described either by outsiders or by relatives using a very specific set of physical terms, dark-complected, olive-skinned, black-haired, or not quite white, but not anything else either, while still being legally and socially treated as white within its own community. 19th century travelers, missionaries, and government surveyors who wrote about these communities almost always began with physical descriptions. Visitors repeatedly described residents of these ridge communities as dark-skinned or swarthy, sometimes noting straight black hair or features that appeared vaguely Mediterranean or Middle Eastern to them, features that did not match the plainly English or Scots-Irish appearance they associated with most of the surrounding mountain population. And yet, almost every one of those same accounts also notes that within their own hollows, these families lived, worked, worshipped, and married largely as accepted members of the local white community, even while outsiders passing through or officials arriving from the county seat treated them with open suspicion the moment they left their own ridge. That contradiction, fully accepted as white at home but doubted or denied the moment they stepped beyond it, runs through nearly every surviving written account of these communities from the 19th century. If your family has old photographs or descriptions passed down across generations that do not quite match the racial identity the family officially claimed, dark features attached firmly to a story of pure English or Scots-Irish ancestry that never made complete visual sense to anyone studying the actual pictures. That mismatch has been appearing in Melungeon descended families for 200 years. It is often the exact detail that eventually sends someone searching for a DNA test, usually decades after the rest of the family stopped asking those questions out loud. Sign 6. Your family carries an old, deeply held story about a Native American ancestor, almost always a Cherokee grandmother, that nobody has ever actually been able to document with a single record. This might be the single most common family legend across the entire American South, and it shows up with unusual concentration in and around historically Melungeon communities specifically. A great-great-grandmother, sometimes described as full Cherokee, sometimes elevated all the way to Cherokee royalty, a chief's daughter passed down through the family with absolute conviction for 4 or 5 generations, and almost no paper trail anywhere to back it up, no tribal roll listing, no marriage record naming her tribe, nothing beyond the story itself. Here's what the genetic research has actually found. Testing on documented, surname-verified Melungeon descended families has generally turned up far less Native American ancestry than these family legends would suggest, and in a significant number of cases, none at all. What a growing number of researchers now believe happened is that Cherokee grandmother became, over time, a safer and far more socially acceptable explanation for unexplained ancestry than the alternative. Claiming Native American heritage carried dramatically less legal and social risk across most of the post-war South than claiming any African ancestry did, particularly after Reconstruction and well into the Jim Crow era, when a documented drop of African ancestry could trigger everything from social exclusion to formal legal reclassification under increasingly strict state blood quantum and racial purity laws. A Cherokee ancestor was, in a very real sense, survivable in a way an African ancestor was not. If your family carries this exact story, an undocumented Native ancestor invoked specifically to explain physical features or an ancestry percentage that never quite matched the rest of the family narrative, that story itself, regardless of whether it turns out to be true in your specific case, is a well-documented pattern specifically associated with families working to explain a Melungeon background in terms the surrounding culture was actually willing to accept. And that brings us to sign 7, the one that connects everything directly to the DNA test results you may already be holding. Sign 7. Your DNA test shows a combination. Your family history has never been able to fully explain meaningful European ancestry, usually English with a smaller Scots-Irish component, alongside a small but genuinely real percentage of sub-Saharan African ancestry, and often little to no Native American ancestry at all, despite generations of Cherokee family lore insisting otherwise. The most detailed genetic research into this population comes largely from independent researcher Roberta Estes, whose work through the Melungeon DNA Project, published and expanded through the 2000s and into peer-reviewed research in the 2010s, combined Y chromosome testing, which traces the direct paternal line, with mitochondrial DNA testing, which traces the direct maternal line across dozens of documented families carrying the core Melungeon surnames. The combined picture that emerged, and that has been broadly supported by subsequent researchers working with the same core surname families, was remarkably consistent. These families carry European ancestry, predominantly English, with the Scots-Irish component typically arriving later, mixed with African ancestry entering specifically through the paternal line in a meaningful number of cases, in some family lines dating back as early as the late 1600s and into the early 1700s. That timing is the single most important detail in this entire story, and it's the part almost nobody outside serious genealogical research circles actually knows. That mixing happened during the colonial period, generations before the antebellum plantation economy that most Americans automatically associate with mixed Southern ancestry. It happened, in a meaningful number of documented cases, among free people, in the brief window before Virginia and the surrounding colonies fully closed the legal door on interracial marriage and free black land ownership. In other words, a real number of Melungeon families were not descended from unions forced under slavery at all. They descended from free, and in some documented cases legally married, couples in an earlier, far more fluid colonial Virginia and Carolina, before the law caught up and slammed that window shut for good. Once that window closed, families who had been free, landowning, and locally accepted for 2 or 3 full generations suddenly found themselves reclassified overnight by new legislation, restricted in where they could live, who they could marry, and what rights they could exercise, and pushed, county by county, onto the least desirable land still available, which is exactly the isolated ridge and hollow geography where these communities took root and quietly stayed put for the next 2 centuries. So here is the actual pattern to look for in your own results, laid out plainly. If your ancestry test shows a small, otherwise unexplained percentage of sub-Saharan African ancestry, sitting alongside a majority English or broadly Northwestern European profile, combined with little or no Native American ancestry, despite a strong, specific family story insisting otherwise, and your roots trace to Hancock County, Newman's Ridge, or the surrounding counties along the Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky border, that specific combination is close to a textbook Melungeon genetic signature. And if your Ancestry platform's DNA community feature groups you alongside historically Melungeon-associated Appalachian genetic clusters, that's the platform's own algorithm, working from a completely different data set than any historian ever used, independently arriving at the same conclusion the paper record has been quietly pointing toward for 200 years. The DNA is not contradicting your family's story so much as it is finally filling in the one specific part of it that nobody, for 2 centuries, was ever legally or socially safe enough to say out loud. It's worth pausing here on why it took genetics this long to catch up to a mystery this well documented in the paper record. Melungeon families didn't just fail to leave records by accident, they largely avoided leaving honest records on purpose because an honest paper trail was, for most of American history, actively dangerous to the family holding it. Most of the court records that do survive exist only because an outsider forced the issue, a tax dispute, a contested land claim dragged in front of a judge, or a marriage license challenged by a clerk who didn't like the couple standing in front of him. Family Bibles left names and relationships conspicuously blank. Census answers flipped depending entirely on who was asking that particular year and how safe the family felt, giving an honest answer. For the vast majority of American history, DNA was the one record these families never had the ability to selectively leave out, because it was never a record anyone was consciously keeping in the first place. It was simply carried forward, silently, generation after generation, waiting for the technology to finally exist that could read it back. There's one more thing worth knowing before we wrap up, because it explains why this story still matters right now in the present day, and not just as historical trivia. Melungeon identity has become something of a flashpoint in modern genealogy and DNA circles, precisely because it sits at the intersection of family pride, documented history, and some genuinely unresolved scientific debate. Not every claim of Melungeon ancestry floating around online in Facebook genealogy groups or in self-published family histories is equally well supported. Some of the wilder theories, ancient Mediterranean seafarers, pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, or entire lost civilizations hiding in the Tennessee mountains, are not supported by the genetic evidence. And they are generally treated by serious researchers as exactly the kind of colorful folklore we talked about back in Sign 3, stories that feel good to tell, but that the DNA simply doesn't back up. What the science does support, consistently across multiple independent research teams, is the more grounded and honestly more remarkable story. A free, mixed-race population that formed in colonial Virginia earlier than almost anyone assumed possible, that got legally and socially pushed to the margins once the law caught up to them, and that survived, intact, in the same tight cluster of mountain counties for 2 full centuries, without ever fully losing itself. 7 signs, and every single one of them points back to the same population. Families who were pushed to the far edges of settled Appalachia, not because they arrived late to the frontier, but because a legal system that hardened around them needed somewhere to put people it had no honest legal category for. They built their homes on ridgelines, chosen specifically for isolation. They kept their own counsel. They told outsiders whichever origin story felt safest that particular decade. And underneath every one of those stories, they quietly carried forward a very real, very specific, and genuinely fascinating ancestry through 200 straight years of official denial, shifting census boxes, courtroom arguments over the right to vote, and family silence passed down at the kitchen table. If you recognized your own family somewhere in 3 or more of these 7 signs, the geography chosen for isolation, the surname pulled straight from the historical core list, the shifting and contradictory records, the physical description that never quite matched the official family story, the undocumented Cherokee grandmother standing in for something else, and finally the DNA combination that doesn't line up with anything the family ever actually told you, there is a real, genuine chance that this specific 300-year-old history belongs to you. Subscribe right now if this video just connected something in your own family history that never quite made sense before today. Every single week on this channel, we go this deep into the hidden histories behind the bloodlines that actually built America, the ones that never made it into a single textbook. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one, and leave a comment down below right now. Did your DNA test come back with an unexplained African percentage? And little or no Native American ancestry, despite a family story insisting otherwise? Tell me your surname, and tell me exactly which Appalachian county your family traces back to. That's where the real conversations happen on this channel, and I read every single one.